Hello and welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on what time zone you're on. We will just get we will wait for a few seconds for everybody to get in the room. Welcome again and thank you for joining us today for a virtual discussion. And it's also Women's History Month. We still have a few days, so we're so excited to continue celebrating and honoring women, especially Black women. Um, so today we are happy to have Dr. Nadia Brown and Dr. Danielle Casares Lemi for their book entitled Sisters Style, The Politics of Appearance for Black Women Political Elites, published in 2021 with Oxford University Press. So if you didn't get a copy, I will drop a link in the chat where you can get it, and even a discount code of 30% that the authors were generously shared with us. So take advantage of it. I'm Dr. Melissa Hafaf. I'm the director of the Gender Justice Initiative at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. We are a cross-campus effort that nurtures and supports research and programs related to intersectional gender justice. Um, and today we are very happy to partner with various organizations to present this conversation to you, including the DC Public Library, the Georgetown Women's and Gender Studies Program, the Georgetown Institute of Politics and Public Service, and the Women's Center. Thank you for their support in bringing this program to you today. Before we start, I will give you a few webinar rules to keep in mind. First, could you please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions at any point during the conversation, and that way it allows for to have them all in one place. And then obviously you can use the chat for comments and reactions. We also have Zoom captioning that you can activate, and as well as an ASL interpreter with us, Jamil Language, who's with us today. Hi, thank you and welcome. Sorry, I think there's been a little bit of trouble to connect. And now the program, which will consist of half hour of conversation between our moderator, our two authors, and then another half hour for Q&A. So get your questions ready. And now let me introduce you to the brilliant feminist scholars and speakers of the day. Dr. Nadia Brown joined our Georgetown faculty last fall as a professor of government and African American studies, and she's also the chair of the Women's and Gender Studies program. Her research and teaching focuses on identity politics, intersectionality of race and gender, political behavior and representations, and Black women's studies. She's the author and editor of several award-winning books, including Sister Style and also Sisters in the State House, Black Women and Legislative Decision Making, also published with Oxford University Press in 2014. And beyond her prolific scholarly work, Professor Brown is also a sexual assaulted advocate and part of the #MeTooPoliSci collective, where she works to stop sexual harassment in the discipline. Dr. Brown received a PhD in political science from Rutgers and is also a proud Howard alumna. Dr. Danielle Casares Lemi is a scholar of political science and a fellow at the John G. Tower Center for Political Studies at the Southern Methodist University. Her research and work specializes in representation in American politics with a focus on identity, race, and gender. And beyond Sister Style, she's also the author of numerous articles that can be found in the Journal of Race, Ethnicity, and Politics, the Du Bois Review, or the British Journal of Political Science. Dr. Lemi received her PhD in political science at the University of California, Riverside. Thank you and welcome. And finally, the moderator for the conversation, who is also a scholar who specializes in political representation and behavior at the intersection of gender and race, who is Dr. Jamil Scott, who is an assistant professor of government at Georgetown University. Thank you all for joining us. We are so excited. We are very honored to have you and to learn from you today. Welcome.
Thank you, Melissa. And thank you, Nadia and Danielle, for being here with us to have this conversation. Um, uh, I'm sure there's so many things to talk about as it relates to the politics of appearance, and it's a fortuitous time to be having this conversation during Women's History Month. And so I wanted to start off with my first question in thinking about the writing process and the writing process as women of color. So what would you share as lessons learned in the process of writing a co-authored book, particularly given your positionalities as women of color and your status in the discipline?
Thank you. Thank you, Jamil, for asking us this question. I think it's a great way to start off a conversation that's rooted in our own social locations and lived realities and how we bring to bear scholarship and new productions of knowledge, particularly in the field of political science, but also in other interdisciplinary fields like women's and gender studies and Africana studies for a particular case on this book. So for us, this was a kind of serendipitous meeting. And I think Danielle can talk a little bit more into how we met and what that looked like. But it was a very fortunate, I think, time in both of our lives where we were working through and struggling with how to present the voices of legislators or political elites in particular of color in ways that were reflective of their own or our own, right, to really be clear, our own understanding of cultural reflexivity and through a feminist lens. So Danielle and I met, I don't know what year that was, Danielle.
2015, 20-ish.
Yeah. And Danielle was finishing up her PhD at the University of California, Riverside, and my forever co-author, Sarah Grishon, and I were leading a dissertation workshop for students in American politics who were writing on intersectional politics. And Danielle was part of that group, but we had exchanged emails prior to that. But really doing this workshop is when I really got a chance to see Danielle's just her skill, particularly as a methodologist, and that which is outside of my own field, right? I'm an interpretivist, I'm an ethnographer, I do participant observation, qualitative methods, but I was impressed with the skill that Danielle had. But more so, right, that she was asking questions that were different than other methodologists asked, right? She was trying to figure out how can she present the voices of the legislators that she's speaking with in ways that are true to their culture and without giving too much away, right? So recognizing that there is this both invisibility and hypervisibility that legislators of color often face. And I remember thinking like how impressed I was with Danielle asking this question, because that was something that I myself had grappled with when I was writing the book Citrus in the State House, and didn't have anyone to talk to about this, right? Like there isn't a model in political science on how to do this. And it really, was this kind of full circle moment where I was now in a position as a more senior scholar to work with a junior scholar to think through how to do this. So Danielle.
Thanks, Nadia. So that's I hadn't thought about our meeting in that way. I've always started in like 2014. So in 2014-ish, I was working on my dissertation and I was getting ready to go interview a bunch of state legislators. I had never done this before, and so I was like, "What do you just call them? Like, do you just make an appointment and show up? I don't know." But I had read Nadia's work because her first book, Sisters in the State House, it was in the same vein of what I was trying to do. And so I read the book, and then I read the appendix, and Nadia had written out exactly what she had done to make contact with legislators, why she was asking the questions the way that she was, detail on like how they were interacting with her, how she was interacting with them. And so it was very helpful for me to understand, okay, like these are the things I need to do in these interviews, the things I need to be aware of. And so when it was time to start writing up the chapter, I contacted Nadia and I was like, hey, I read your book. I'm doing this thing. Would you be willing to give me some feedback? I'd really appreciate it. And then she responded and she was like, you want to get on a call for 15 minutes? And I was like, okay. And then I think, I can't remember like if we had met at a conference very briefly the following year, and then we did the dissertation workshop. And then we just kind of kept in touch. And like what I really liked about working with Nadia was that, this thing about like, how do you present the narratives of legislators of color in a way that, you're respecting what they told you. Like these are politicians, a lot of them are lawyers. And often I think, when you're interviewing politicians, they don't really care what they say to you. Like they're saying it to you because it's okay for them to say. But it's still really important to think about respecting them and being very proactive about, is what I'm going to print, it's not going to come out for years. They could retreat from public life and just be private people by the time my piece comes out. You have to be proactive and think about, am I respecting them? Am I making sure that, whatever I'm printing isn't giving away who said it? Even if they don't care, you still got to think about it. And so that's what I really liked about working with Nadia, because Nadia was thinking about these things too.
So in the book, you all make the argument that the phenotypic differences amongst Black women politicians impacts how they experience office and how Black voters evaluate them. And so thinking about the major takeaways of the book, what do you want readers to take away as the next steps or the actionable items? Should we expect a well-reasoned voter to be mindful of the politics of appearance, especially as we start to think about this upcoming election cycle?
So for me, I think there are two takeaways that are related, but are for different audiences. So for the first audience, or academic scholars that I want us to be speaking with and engaging with, because in our discipline of political science, there is often like an air to Black people and Black women in particular as deviant or being outside of the norm, and then trying to theorize from a position of otherness, of inferiority, of deviance. And what I want this book to say is that this is white supremacy. These are Black women as rational actors responding to a constraint of white supremacy, right? That prioritizes a certain look that is often related to, right, skin color or the texture and style of one's hair. So it's not that these women aren't smart, they're not qualified, like all of these things we know to be the case, right? But the conversation around what they look like has to be put into context of saying that they are responding to white supremacy. And the way that they're doing so is through the politics of the politics of respectability. And respectability politics is a concept that historian Evelyn Higginbotham coined in 1993 when she was looking at Black club women, particularly Black Baptist club women in Reconstruction era, where they tried to use white Victorian middle-class norms to kind of buttress them from racist and sexist attacks by saying, look at us, right? We are feminine women, Black women who are upholding the same kind of values that your society, your racist society says we should do. And because we can do this, you should treat us in a way that is respectable, that you should not treat us poorly or think that we are inferior because we are Black women. So this was a tactic, right, to thwart white supremacy. Of course, right, know that the multiple iterations and the ways that politics of respectability have been leveraged have been oftentimes against Black women assigned female at birth, Black femmes, and non-binary folks, and particularly those with lower incomes, lower education, or other kind of marginalized status. So I want the scholars that are reading this to put that into effect, but I also want that to come into our conversations of how we're talking about what we can expect. Because as the book, kind of ends with, right, the gold standard is still, right, this imagined Black woman politician with straightened hair that is lighter skin. And the question that Danielle and I want, we end the book with a question to say, well, why does this continue to be the gold standard? And in actuality, right, the women that are running don't look like this, right? And some of the women that are winning don't look like this, but we still have this in our imagined mind's eye. And I think if we aren't getting serious about these connections, these like through lines of, again, like white supremacy and Black women's reactions to white supremacy, we will continue to hold up this ideal that that Black women should look a certain way. So when we go into the primaries, I want pundits to start talking about Black women's agency as constrained, and not necessarily that they are these rational actors that have decided to look a certain way or to present themselves in another way that doesn't take into account, right, the history, the legacies, and the continued salience of white supremacy, anti-Black racism, and then what that looks like on the body politic of Black women.
This is a really good question. I think for me, the big takeaway is that I see our book as a resource for Black women thinking about running for office, Black women who are already in office and like who want to like perhaps make sense of like what they're experiencing, things that people are saying to them. And I think what's useful about the book is that, one, it sets this context, right? The politics of appearance is rooted in white supremacy. But then two, for the people actually advising candidates, so like campaign consultants, to me, if I were a campaign consultant, I would take from this, don't comment, don't, give your unsolicited advice about how a Black woman candidate should appear, and think about where that advice is coming from. I think, just thinking about like some of our interviews when we did a focus group with Black women who had run for office or who had held office, like one of the things that really stood out for me was that the folks who are giving this kind of advice, they might not even know Black women's constituents, right? So it's a couple of things. It's one, right? Don't you think that anyone who has decided to run for office has already thought about this stuff generally, right? Obviously, you would think about this if you're going to run. And then two, you don't know who the candidate is trying to connect with, right? So there was a moment in the book where we talk about, millennials saying, I want to wear, a certain kind of sweater. I want to do my makeup a certain way. I want to look a certain way. It makes me feel good. And like for us as millennials sitting in the room, I'm a non-Black voter. I'm like, yeah, you do that. That's awesome. That's great. I would enjoy that and like want to connect with that candidate if I met that candidate. And so to me, it's one, outdated ideas of what a woman candidate, of what a Black woman candidate should look like, and then outdated ideas of what the voters even want when they want to get to know a candidate.
Yeah, thank you for those takeaways. I think those are really helpful, thinking about what's next, right? And how candidates can and should be thinking about themselves. So my next question is there a narrative or an observation that sticks with you from the process of data collection for the book? You guys engage in a really, great effort of a multi-method data collection. And so, I think as folks are maybe in the discipline or not in the discipline, thinking about the type of work that you did to put the book together, what's something that stuck with you?
We had a good time. Like that I wish that other people can have co-authors that they enjoy working with, and also just as people and enjoying things. So we did the data collection in so we did focus groups. I did the interviews alone, but we did focus groups together, and we made the decision that as a Black woman, I would be the one to ask questions and to be the face of the focus groups and to engage. And Danielle sat, I think, to the left of me, and then took notes and kind of was there in the background. So that was a deliberate decision that we made, that we wanted the Black women, political elites and voters to engage and talk with me, right? And kind of engage in some like sister to sister talk, which is a phrase that anthropologists use to describe data collection when you are a member, when you are a Black woman and you are conducting research on another Black woman. And that was really useful because we were able to, after the focus groups, we were able to compare notes, and there were things that I saw and I wanted to highlight, and things that Danielle saw and wanted to highlight, and sometimes they didn't match up. Oftentimes they did, right? The vast majority of the time they didn't, but listening to those spaces where there were gaps were really learning, really helpful for me in learning and instructive. The other thing I'll say is that we had a good time, which meant that this project was a labor of love, right? And so Danielle and I were in Dallas, went to Deep Ellum. We had drinks and enjoyed like nightlife. When she came to Indianapolis, we went out, we actually crashed somebody's holiday party and had a really, really great time. And so we played hard, we worked hard. And so some of the things that I find to be, personally a little disappointing is that this book came out during the pandemic and we haven't been face to face. We hadn't had time to celebrate the book, to take a picture together, and to just enjoy the success of the accomplishment. But the data collection, I think, was bolstered by this really kind of collegial relationship that we have, and the way that we were able to talk with one another because we have such different methodological orientations, and then to do so in a way that wasn't contentious, because again, like there are definitely disciplinary camps on like how research can and should be done. And I share the part about us having a good time and partying and just like hanging out as a way to show that while we did have some conversations that like, should we do things this way, or can we look about things this other way? But at the end of the day, we had a really good time just enjoying one another and our company. And so I respect and value her as a person. And I'm sure that she respects and values me as a person. And that made the data collection much easier.
Yeah, I agree. We had a lot of fun putting this book together. And like, I don't know how other collaborations go, but I feel like ours was probably like the funnest if we had to write it down. But one of the things that I did take away from the data collection, for folks thinking about, doing research on elites, often in political science, it's very difficult to get on their calendars, even to just do one-on-one interviews. We did a whole focus group, and like that to me was very game changing, because one, it's hard to pull that off. But then two, the kind of data that you get, it was just, there's just no way that we could have gotten that same sort of interaction if it was just one-on-one. Because as we were sitting in the focus group, there were moments where Nadia and we just kind of receded into the background, and like the participants were taking the conversation in different directions and organically interacting with each other. And it gave us so many more insights than we would have had if we had talked to each person one-on-one. And so, for folks doing research on elites, like if you can do it, I so recommend trying to do a focus group just to capture that group interaction.
Gotcha. So I think the last question before we get into some questions from the audience will be, as we think about Black women being socialized to think about what is respectable or not as relates to their appearance, in what ways are Black women bucking notions of respectability politics, and what ways are they not?
Yeah, so I guess I'll give the disappointing news up first and then go into like the more hopeful. So I don't see respectability politics going anywhere anytime soon, right? And even with the intergenerational conversations that we had, right, the millennials were really pushing the boundaries of respectability politics and asking right, their older Black women counterparts, but why does this matter? And how, and why do we still continue to do this? But that yet and still, right, there were little things that would fall back on respectability in other comments that they would make, or in their responses to others, which made me, which makes us think that this is not going to end perhaps in our lifetime. And right, if respectability politics started in, Reconstruction era and right in the 1860s, in 2022, can we say that it will leave us by 2050 or something? I don't think so. But I am heartened by how just the genuine ways in that women entered into these conversations where they recognized that this was problematic. And none of the women, right, regardless of generation, shared that, right, having to adhere to respectability politics in their look and dress is something that we should not try to do away with. Again, like as these rational actors who are aware of white supremacy, they would come back to this notion of, yes, it's something that I would like to do. However, I live in America, right? And I'm still held to certain norms and standards that the way that I would like to present myself might not get me elected. And then others who were, fully just saying, we're fully embracing respectability politics, right? So people that were trying to buck the norm in little ways, like the woman that Danielle just mentioned, who liked to wear pink lipstick and she says she wanted to beat her face and do all types of makeup and hairstyles and do her funky, do funky twist outs in her afro, to women who were like, I'm a judge. So even when I'm at my kid's soccer game, I am wearing a t-shirt that has my, elect so-and-so to whatever district court, and I put on a blazer. Now she did this in Texas at a kid's soccer game, right? So I'm thinking like, whoa, you must be really hot, right? But she was like, that's what judges should look like, right? So even when I am on my downtime with my family, at the soccer game, I need to represent my brand. And for me as a judge, I have to look judicial at all times. So she was fully right, embracing some parts of this respectability politics, whereas other women were not. So I share this to say, right, there is the spectrum of what this looks like, but I think that this will be with us for some time.
Thank you for that. And so it's just since we're on the topic of judges, one of the questions that came in prior to the start of this talk was, how has the nomination for Ketanji Brown Jackson affected your perspective on this topic?
Okay, so I am, it's a deep sigh because I'm still processing this, right? And so some of the things that are sitting with me are the deep joys of like this nomination and ending up this hearing. And so one of the things for me was taking my daughters to the Supreme Court on Monday for a rally with other Black women, political leaders. And my 4-year-old said, she looks like me, right? Ketanji Brown Jackson, Judge Jackson, has hair like mine. And then she, looked at my locks and said, and she has hair like yours. And also she's dark skinned and wears glasses like me, right? So, so the girls were really they saw themselves in her, and we're very, very excited. And that for me was really, really hopeful, and not as a political scientist, but as a mother of young Black girls, right? Just seeing their excitement, it's a sense of joy that I still hold on to. But on the other hand, right, to watch this woman be verbally accosted by white men and a white woman, like we can't let Marsha Blackburn off the hook, right? To have to just sit there and the way that Black women continue or have throughout this nation, right, taken abuse, vitriolic, words and verbal abuse in this nation, right? That was on full display. And she had to comport herself in a way that adhered to respectability politics, right? So when people are lobbying, to be clear, very racist and sexist attacks on her, right? Questioning her judgment and cherry picking her judgment in ways that were deeply racist and sexist. And she had to sit there without showing any emotion, all right? Like we are celebrating that type of abuse. And celebrating her for that, right? Without calling out the continued, white heteropatriarchal supremacy that we live in that makes this happen, right? So like I keep drawing back to the way that Amy Coney Barrett was praised for having 7 children, right? And being this working mom, and that would help her and aid her in her judgment on the court. Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, a mother of 2 daughters, 2 Black daughters, didn't get the same leverage, right? Wasn't able to weaponize or to use her motherhood in that way. In fact, right, it seemed as a null point, or you think even worse, that she was categorized as a sapphire, right? A Black woman who could care less about her children, right? That she's angry, she's mean, and she is doing this to our nation's children by letting sexual predators go away almost scot-free. And she wasn't able to draw back on, like, I'm a mother. Why do you think that I would, why would you think that I would want to let predators get off scot-free? But it's a very politicized motherhood that was not available to her as a Black woman, right? The way that, again, we saw this with Amy Coney Barrett. So I want to be like Cory Booker, right? I still want to sit on my joy on this one, right? But I am, right, deeply, deeply angry, and the way that we still see respectability politics showing up, right? Everything, from her dress, right, from the French manicure, from her sister locks or micro locks being curled at the end in ever so perfect manner, right? And the way that she had to sit and compose herself while she was being attacked. And again, did not have that level of vitriolic responses to Amy Coney Barrett, even when the Democrats were questioning her about the ACA and what she would do. And I'll just end with this quickly too. The other thing that's still blowing my mind are that there are legal precedent cases that were asked of her that were mostly centering around Dred Scott and Plessy versus Ferguson. And there have been other legal cases that could have been used, but to question this Black woman on, or to bring up questions around slavery and enslavement, and then also other questions that have to do with Loving versus Virginia, knowing that she is married to a white man, right? And then, right, and my former state senator when I lived in Indiana, right, talking about, right, should that even be legal? Should miscegenation be a thing in the Constitution, right? It was just all mind-blowing. So that these are just examples of how this Black woman is supposed to comport herself in this dignified manner when she is subjected to a level of racist and sexist vitriol that just didn't happen to a white woman that was in her seat just a couple of months ago. It's mind-boggling.
Thank you for that. Danielle, were you going to say something or?
No, I was prepping my thoughts for the Kamala Harris Vogue cover.
Okay. And so we had another question come up. It comes back to this question of how Black women show up as politicians, but also in the public sphere. And, we had someone ask, what was your take on Kamala Harris's Vogue cover?
So for folks who might not have been following it closely, so months ago, Vogue put a cover of Kamala Harris, and I think it was the one where she was depicted wearing her chucks, and like it wasn't, the background looked like it was like a draft background, like it didn't look like it was like the final shot. And apparently, I was just reading an article where it was talking about how like somebody from her team had expressed like that's not the photo that she wanted to be on the cover. And so I've been thinking about this a lot, and I have like, I think there are two ways to interpret this, right? So on one hand, she is the vice president of the United States, right? And so some folks might be like, well, who cares? She's a politician. She's number 2 in command. She's among the most powerful people in the world. Yes. But this right here, like, not listening to her team and saying, hey, this is the picture that we want. We feel good about this one. Go ahead and run this. Like, that is so microaggressive. And to me, it kind of begs the question of like, to me, the way I've been thinking about this more and more, I'm like, that's kind of a power move, because Kamala Harris is not like a pop star who can get on Instagram and be like, hey, nobody buy Vogue. She can't do that. And so what is her team supposed to do except to say, this is not the photo we approved? It's not like she can wield her influence the way somebody like a celebrity can do. Would Vogue do that to a celebrity who could actually like, I don't know, escalate it and like sue them, like make them lose subscriptions or whatever? And so it's particularly very it's just an acute microaggression, particularly since the editor is a white woman. And it's like, why did you have to do that? Why couldn't you just go with the picture that her team selected? No matter whatever she was wearing, however it looked, if that's what her team selected, just go with that. And so to me, it was a very specific kind of power move, knowing that they probably would not even treat a celebrity that way.
Yeah, thank you for that observation, Danielle. You brought up something that I think is really interesting, and one that we don't talk enough about in political science: the power of a team and the campaign professionals behind the scenes on the campaign trail. So, thinking about the individual as a candidate and the team behind them, what do you think that campaign professionals need to be thinking about as it relates to having a candidate or working for a candidate, or as they trying to promote their brand, the term that you all used, or thinking about how do we promote Black women as candidates, on the campaign trail?
So my short answer is that from our research, campaign staffers should let Black women be who they are and let them show up in their fullness. So in 3 of the one-on-one interviews that I did, the women who had campaign staffers that tried to create a different image for them, actually 5, not 3, tried to create a different image for them, they ended up losing. And one of the women shared that she thinks it's because voters couldn't get to know her authentic self, and that she felt really uncomfortable in how she was styled, that she just didn't feel like herself when she would put on clothes. So one of the women that I'm in particular I'm thinking about is a woman from the Virginia House of Delegates, the lower house, who was running to get a seat in the Senate. It would have been the first Black woman senator in that district ever, and had this really empowering, kind of like bottom up story where she and her mom were homeless. And she tells this story with such compassion that draws people in. And she had shared that she liked wearing bright colors. She liked wearing her hair kind of like big and curly. She wore lots of, not a lot of makeup, but just she always liked having on a lipstick that was a bright color as well. So one of her staffers suggested, where either you're going to wear the bright lipstick or you're going to wear the bright dress. You're doing too much. And they put her in pantsuits. They kind of toned down the color of her lipstick. Her hair was already straightened, but she would just wear them in like big kind of loose curls. And then they straightened her hair all the way so that it was flat, right? Like a little bend on the end. And she said she looked in the mirror and felt like she looked 10 years older with those changes. And she would say that when she was sharing her story with voters about her and her mom's story from homelessness to her getting a full ride to George Mason University, and then going on to become the youngest Black woman delegate in the Virginia lower house, that usually people lean into this story, right? It's compelling. And it's also like one of those feel-good American stories. But she said that when she felt like she had on, right, this kind of caricature of herself, this different kind of outfit, her hair was styled differently, her makeup was toned down, that people were just like, right, like, okay, right? They weren't as invested in the story. And then she reflected that some of it might have been like, I felt more comfortable. So I was animated, and I was, not telling the story as a very kind of sanguine kind of way, but actually a much more, personal and, inviting people into my story and making them feel comfortable to ask me questions. Right. So, and so she said part of that uniform helped her, it didn't make her feel like herself. And likewise, another woman, and this woman's story isn't in the book, and I don't know why we didn't, in hindsight, like, I don't know why we didn't include it. But one of the women that we do include, Lindsay Blackwell, this story still haunts me. She was running for St. Louis County prosecuting attorney, and we met 4 days before the election. And she knew she was going to lose, right? It was like the writing was on the wall. She was running against the 24-year incumbent, who later went on to win. And so we met 4 days before the election. Mike Brown, and she loses 4 days later. Mike Brown was murdered in Ferguson, Missouri, which is in St. Louis County, 5 days later. That 24-year-old incumbent then puts together a grand jury that found that failed to indict Darren Wilson, the police officer that murdered Mike Brown. And this woman shared with me 4 days before the election, right, that she had chemically straightened her hair and she had done things to make other people feel happy with her. And she didn't feel happy, right? So whether it was these constituents, she kept saying, voters up here, in St. Louis County don't, they think my twists are too militant, and I can't just get the North County vote. I have to get the West County and South County vote. So I straightened my hair. Her husband liked her hair straight. And so she did all of this for other people and was deeply unhappy and kind of felt out of touch with her body. And then also kind of lamented that, in order to get that chemical process out of her head, she had to either cut off all of her hair or take on a year-long journey or more to grow out the chemical process. And I sit back and think about just how uncomfortable she was and how disappointed that she had made that decision, because she thought it was going to help her get elected. And she saw the writing on the wall that she wasn't going to get elected. And then I wonder, what would have been different if a Black woman prosecuting attorney oversaw that grand jury indictment? Would there be a different trajectory towards our Black Lives Matter movement, particularly in Ferguson, Missouri? Would there have been justice for Mike Brown? Would Derek Wilson be held accountable in some way? We don't know the answers to those questions, but I kind of saw the writing on the wall, right, the 4 days before the election, that she just wasn't going to eat this one out.
I think when it comes to the role of the team, versus the individual candidate, I think the big takeaway from the book for folks who get hired onto these teams is that you're not hired to dictate what the candidate does. The candidate is the one in charge of the campaign. They're hiring you to take the load off of doing things like collecting information, going out, talking to people, bringing that information back to the candidate to make decisions, right? And so it's kind of for consultants who get really who get stuck on trying to dictate how a Black woman should style herself, what she should wear, how she should do her hair, her makeup, whatever. That's not really your role. It's your role to say, here are all your options. Here are the pros and cons. What do you think? And the focus should be on, how can I help support this candidate? Do, mock coaching sessions, whatever we have to do, so that they're comfortable, so that they're authentic, so that when they're interacting with the constituents, they are doing the best that they can, and they don't feel they're oh, I'm stuffed up, that's your role as the staffer. It's not to dictate to the candidate, it's to provide information and support.
Thank you both for those observations. So we have some questions from the chat. This first question is a twofer. So the Crown Act recently passed the House. Do you see legislation like that as part of the solution? And then I'll just throw out the second question out so that you all can have this one in mind. Do you have concerns as well as advice for Stacey Abrams' 2022 gubernatorial campaign based on your research?
Yes, so the Crown Act passing the House is monumental. It's also made its way through several state legislatures and local jurisdictions. I am always a glass half full kind of person by personality. And I want to remind us that there are some states that are having a very hard time passing this because it seems a frivolous bill, because majority of legislators don't have Afro-textured hair that need a protective style. They see this as needless legislation. And so we've seen pushback against this in particularly some Republican states that have now are using the Crown Act as a campaign strategy to say, if you get Democrats in power, they're going to pass these really stupid, silly bills because it doesn't affect them. they don't think it impacts a large number of people. So I say that to say passing the House is great, but if looking at the states is any indication of what we might impact this bill in the future as it moves its way, hopefully to the Senate and to President Biden's desk, I think this will be a campaign talking point for Republicans about how out of touch Democrats have been, because they don't see this as something that, because for them it doesn't happen, right? So because it doesn't happen to them, it must not happen to other people. And for Stacey Abrams, I'm super excited for 2022. Lord, don't go back to 2020. I do think that we're going to see some difference here in this campaign. I think Stacey Abrams has proven herself on at the local level, right, to Georgia voters. But let's be real, like the Georgia state legislature has stacked the deck against her, and are very intentional about the redistricting, about voters' access to the ballot. But also, one thing that might be on the advantageous for Abrams is that there's going to be a split race, right? There are 2 Republicans running, and that could help to dilute the Republican vote. So this will be a very, very different race, and I'm keeping my eye on this. And I'll quickly note in relationship to our book, Stacey Abrams is one of the figures that we open up with, right? It's one of the examples that we show differences of Black women's politics as visible through their bodies. So Stacey Abrams goes on The Breakfast Club, which is an urban syndicated radio show, and tells to the host when she's running in 2018 that some don't think she's viable because she's dark-skinned, heavy-set, has natural hair, and no husband. And the hosts of the show laugh that off and say, oh, but you're qualified, and then go on to run down all of her qualifications. Those things aren't separable, right? She is qualified and she is also this woman that looks like this, right? And that deep uncomfortability of talking about how she looks in relationship to what people think Black women politicians should look like, we just haven't addressed. And they didn't address it on that show in 2018, and we still haven't gotten around to addressing that for Stacey Abrams in 2022.
I'm optimistic about the Crown Act. I hope that it passes because I think that it's making this salient to people who have never thought about it. And so it's contributing to a shift in conversations in places like workplaces in particular. I think that's a key piece about preventing workplace discrimination against Black people who wear natural hairstyles, because I think, just to make the connection to the book, like, the people sitting in HR writing these policies, those are voters. And so they're evaluating Black women candidates, and they need to know that what you're doing in the workplace, you are discriminating against the same kind of people who could run for office one day and be your state legislator, be your congressional member. And so I do think it will help, and I'm hopeful that it fully passes.
All right, so our next question comes back to that conversation we had about Ketanji Brown Jackson, and so this attendee is wondering if y'all could speak to how Ted Cruz's comments about Brown's belief in critical race theory was being weaponized against her.
Oh, okay, so infuriating, because it's just not true. That's the other part, right? But like, Republicans don't need facts, clearly. But I think this gives us an insight into what we'll see in the midterm election in 7 months, that Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson is a mainstream judge by all accounts, right? That she is not a leftist. She is not a communist like was lobbied against Constance Motley Baker. She is a pretty, standard by the book judge. But what they're actually doing here is conflating Blackness with CRT. So any Black face, any Black person, any Black woman can stand in for this supposed divisive divisive strategy. And the part that kind of angers me or that makes me fearful for the November elections is because Republicans don't need facts, right? And they're using this very clear shorthand, how they're going to kind of ramp up to 2022. And what I think the Democratic response has already been, and what it'll probably look like in November, No, they want to really show you who Ketanji Brown Jackson is. They want to, pull apart and say, she is this person. This is her record. This is why the Republicans are wrong. Voters need a shorthand, just the way Republicans are giving them a shorthand. Democrats need to give voters a shorthand. And what Democrats have done is individualize this response. Instead, what they need to do, in my opinion, right, and no one's paying me as a political consultant, but if they were, I would say, right, what Democrats need to do is make a universal response and say, this is racist and it's wrong, right? Or this is race baiting and this is wrong. And let's talk about that, right? And so removing perhaps Ketanji Brown Jackson out of the focal point, but really attacking the strategy of conflating Black people with CRT. And we know that not all Black people believe in CRT. Not all Black people teach CRT, right? But this is something that the Republicans have conflated Blackness to CRT. And I think what Democrats really need to do is say, call it out for what it is. It's race baiting. It's not even, coded language. This is explicit language. And then move to the universal and stop trying to just, bolster Ketanji Brown Jackson, but say, if they're doing this to her, it'll definitely happen to Ayanna Pressley. It'll definitely happen to Ilhan Omar. It'll definitely happen to Stacey Abrams. It'll definitely happen to Val Demings, right? Other Black women that are running. So we don't need to individually hype up these women. And then what we need to just say is, they're going to do this to all of us. So how do we attack this? And I think that would be a strategy that would bring more people in, because who has the time, right, to do all this individual research that the Democrats are asking you to do? Republicans are giving you a short heuristic. You need to get one right back.
So earlier you all spoke to this idea of authenticity that comes across when a candidate feels and looks like themselves. And so I'm wondering, some of the questions in the chat kind of speak to this idea of what happens when a candidate changes their appearance. What are the costs to that? And so I know you spoke about that in terms of, a loss, but can that relate to how we think about trust, or how people might see authenticity as it relates to a candidate?
Yes. So in the book, there is a woman who converted to the Nation of Islam, and when she was in her 20 or early, like maybe 18, between 18 and 20, and wore a hijab or Kamara headscarf, and was known in her community as someone who was unapologetically Black, and did a lot of civil rights activism, and owned a bookstore that carried a lot of like Black authors and some other kind of like nationalistic rhetoric or pamphlets and books. She runs for office as for the lower house, for the lower chamber. She's in the House, and she decides to move up to the Senate and decides to basically have a new makeover. And I asked her, like, this is interesting, right? Like, the makeover, kind of talk and explain this. And then she said that the Kamar was making her hair thin around the edges, right around the edges of her head and the nape of her neck, because the fabric was just kind of just rubbing on her hair, and her hair was thinning. And so she decided to stop wearing it. She didn't change her religion, but she just didn't wear that outward marker. And people just thought that she had changed up because she was trying to seek election in the Senate. I don't know what's true, right? Like, so she says that's not the case. She said it was that her hair was thinning, and that's what she decided to do, but her constituents thought perhaps otherwise. I bring this up because she shared a very stinging critique of Black elected officials as not being authentic, and particularly the first numbers of Black elected officials as having to almost look white and talk with a less Negro dialect, as she called it, to be elected. But then fast forward 50 years, and she was accused of doing the same thing, and kind of brushed those things, brushed that off and aside. She did get elected to the Senate. She served in the Senate for 2 terms and then was voted out. But it's this level of authenticity and kind of how far it takes you was the thing that I was most concerned about. So if this works on, a smaller level, if you have less constituents or people that are closest to you, then as opposed to expanding out and representing more people that might not look like you or understand your preferences or your background, did she change because of that? Did her authenticity, whether that was the rationale or not, but for some people it was perceived to be a political tactic to stop wearing her khimar.
Well, as we're almost at the close of our time, I wanted to get both of your thoughts on what do you see as your next projects, right? What has this book brought up in terms of questions about how we might move forward, or new questions that might need to come up as it relates to the politics of appearance? Hopefully not things that you plan to take on as research projects, but just more generally.
Oh, well, that's the type of question. I mean, I am, so we talk about colorism in this book, but we don't necessarily do as much of a deep dive to the legislators and elected officials about this, precisely because colorism is still a taboo topic that we don't talk about in Black societies in public, right? Like, so we talk about hair now in public because of this naturalista movement. But colorism is still this, this taboo topic. So we do run experimental data on this, but we don't talk to legislators as much about this. So I'm interested in that, but I think it would have to be a culturally right time, because if not, I think we're going to get authentic answers. And I think it might be crossing this taboo line. And I think the same goes to be said for body type and body size. And so that, again, comment about Stacey Abrams as being plus size, right? It's something we just don't talk about. And as a petite woman, I am also recognizing that me asking these questions about body size might be off-putting or to people who don't share my body type, right? So having these kind of conversations as an interpretivist, as an ethnographer, would be really difficult. And I recognize that because I started this project when I had straightened hair and ended this project with my hair looking like this. And I can see, right, since 2014 to now doing this project, elected officials have reacted and responded differently to me based on what my hair looks like. And I know that they will respond to me based on what my body, my body type is. The same with my skin tone. So this would be a very difficult project to undertake. I think I'm interested in a reflective piece or something that might ask, right, like, what would this look like? Maybe it's a theoretical piece or a methodological piece for an outlet like PS. I don't necessarily see this as a book project, but I do want to continue to raise these questions.
So I don't know about additional projects that we will add to our portfolio, but I am working on my solo book right now, and appearance is a key part of it. And so I'm doing research on how candidates can or cannot, the constraints under which they can leverage their ethno-racial identities strategically. And the way that you appear to others, the way that people interpret your appearance very much bears on how mixed legislators, folks who have interracial parentage, on the opportunities for them to say, I'm this or I'm that, and for people to accept their identities, the way that people are literally interpreting your appearance. And one of the points that I'm making in my book is that when we talk about descriptive representation, scholars have not actually seriously interrogated the definition of that, because traditionally we think of descriptive representation as tied to visible characteristics, biological characteristics that we map to ethno-racial categories, and we have not seriously interrogated that. And so what happens if you have a legislator who gets confused as being a member of a different group? Do they even count as a descriptive representative? And so that's the thing I'm currently thinking a lot about.
Thank you both for that and for sharing your thoughts on this and for talking about your book project. And so it looks like we are almost at time. So again, please do take the time to get this really awesome book from these awesome scholars. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank you for having us. Thank you for moderating, Jamil, and Melissa for hosting. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing this amazing research with us, Dr. Byrne and Dr. Cesarez, Lemi, and Dr. Scott for interpreting and moderating, and Jamila for interpreting. We also would like to thank our partners again, the DC Public Library, the Georgetown Women's and Gender Studies Program, the Georgetown Institute of Politics and Public Service, and the Women's Center. We have more events coming up, so feel free to go check those out on our website. Thank you, everyone, and have a beautiful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.